Sukkah, Perek Hey, Mishnah Vav. The Kohanim that did the Avodah in the Beis HaMikdash was split into 24 mishmaros, which means 24 watches, 24 groups. Each one of those groups was on duty to do the Avodah in the Beis HaMikdash for 1 week, and then the following week it will be a different group, basically different families. As there were 24 of those mishmaros, those watches, on average, approximately, each watch would have 2 weeks a year, making 48 weeks, 2 weeks a year that they would be on duty. Some years, of course, it would be 3 weeks in that year. This Mishnah discusses the korbanos that were brought on Sukkot. Yom Tov Rishon Shel Chag, on the first day of Sukkot, Hoyu Shom, Shloisha Osa Porim, Ve'elim Shnoim, V'soir Echad. The korbanos that were brought on the first day of Sukkot, these were the communal korbanos, were Shloisha Osa Porim, 13 bullocks, Ve'elim Shnoim, 2 rams, Soir Echad, a he-goat, that was for a chatos, the previous animals were for olos, burnt offerings. And there were a further 14 lambs, Nishtayu Shom Abo Osa Kavosim. There were a further 14 lambs that were brought as the Musaf offering, as olos, on the first day of Sukkot. Although we mentioned that every week a different mishmar was on duty, that was for the normal korbanos that were brought. However, on Yom Tov, the regel, all the mishparos, all the groups, all the watches were allowed to come and partake in the offering of those korbanos which were brought specifically for the regel. As there are 24 watches, if one adds up all these korbanos, this comes to more than 24. So, what did we say? There were 13 porim, 2 elim, and 1 soir. 13 plus 2 plus 1 makes 16. Also, there were a further 14 lambs, the smallest of those korbanos. 14 plus the previous 16 is more than 24. So therefore, the Mishnah says, of those 14 lambs, there were only 8 mishmaros to bring those 14 lambs. Why was that? Because we already mentioned 13 porim, 13, 2 and 1, that's 16. 16 watches, each watch bringing one of those animals. But for the remaining 14 lambs, there are 8 mishmaros to bring those 14 lambs. Says the Mishnah, what they did is they doubled up. B'yom Rishon, on the first day of Sukkot, when there were 13 bullocks and all those korbanos we've just mentioned, they split those 8 mishmaros 6, 2. What does that mean? Shisha makrivim shnayim shnayim. 6 of the remaining watches brought 2 lambs each. Vashar, and the remaining 2 watches, echod echod, would bring 1 each. The second day of Sukkot, Basheni, on the second day of Sukkot, and one can find all these korbanos mentioned in Pinchas. The second day of Sukkot, there weren't 13 bullocks, there were 12 bullocks, which means one has 12 bullocks, 2 rams, 1 he-goat, so 12, 2 and 1, that's 15, which means 15 mishmaros were involved in those korbanos. There are still 14 lambs left. The only change from day to day of Sukkot in the korbanos was there was one of the porim was reduced. Started at 13 and goes to 12, 11, 10, 9, down to 7. So on the second day, there are, as we said before, 15 mishmaros would bring the animals mentioned, the porim, the elim and the soyer. 15, as there are 24 watches, there are 9 watches left to bring the 14 lambs. So the 9 watches are split 5 and 4. What does that mean? Chamisha makrivim shnayim shnayim. 5 of those watches bring 2 each. 5 twos are 10. The remaining 4 watches, v'hasha'ar echod echod, they would bring 1 each. And that makes up the 14. Bashlishi, on the third day of Sukkot, again the porim were reduced by 1. So if the porim are reduced by 1, it means now there are 11 porim, 2 elim and 1 soyer. That's 14 animals, and for the first 14 watches. There are another 14 watches. There are another 10 watches, because there are 10 plus the 14 making 24 watches. So those 10 watches, 10 mishmaros, will be bringing 14 lambs. How is that done? Those 10 watches are split 4 and 6. Arbo makrivim shnayim shnayim. 4 of the watches bring 2 each. That's 8. The remaining 6, v'hasha'ar echod echod, bring 1 each. That's 10 mishmaros bringing the 14 korbanos. The fourth day, again, we've reduced the number of porim by 1. So when we get to the kavosim, instead of 10, there are now 11 watches left to bring all those 14 lambs. How do we split 11 watches to bring the 14 korbanos? The 11 is split 3-8. Boravi shloisha makrivim shnayim shnayim. 3 bring 2 each. That's 6. Vasha'ar, and the remaining 8, they will bring 1 lamb each. The fifth day, we are reducing the porim again by 1, which means by the time you get to the lambs, there are now 12 mishmaros to bring the 14 lambs. How would you split that? The 12 are split 2, 10. What does that mean? B'chamishi shnayim makrivim shnayim shnayim. 2 watches bring 2 each. That's 4. V'hasha'ar, and the remaining 10, because there are 12 watches in total, the 10 will bring 1 each. And that's how your 12 watches bring the 14 lambs. On the 6th day of Sukkot, again we reduce the number of porim by 1, which means by the time you get to the lambs, there are 13 mishmaros to bring 14 lambs. You split the 13, 1, 12. What does that mean? Echod makriv shnayim, just one of those watches brings 2 lambs. The remaining 12 mishmaros bring 1 lamb each, and that's how 12 plus the 1 makes 13 watches, bringing 14 lambs. Bashavi, you reduce on the 7th day the porim by 1. And that means on the 7th day you bring 7 porim, 2 elim, and 1 soyer. 7, 2, and 1. That's 10 animals, 10 mishmaros. Each mishmar will bring 1 of those animals. That means you're left with 14 mishmaros, and there are 14 lambs to bring on the 7th day, because all the animals remain the same except for the porim, which reduced every day by 1. Says the Mishnah, Bashvi kulan shavin, they're all equal. All the mishmaros that are bringing the lambs will all bring 1 each. When it moves to the next day, Shmini Atzeres, continues the Mishnah, Bashmini, on the 8th day, Shmini Atzeres, Chozru lefais kivir golim. They returned back to utilizing a lottery. A pious mentioned the beginning of Yuma, how they did this, because on Shmini Atzeres there were less animals than the 24 mishmaros. They couldn't all partake. Why was that? On the Shmini Atzeres there's just 1 par as an olah, 1 ayil, 1 ram as an olah, 7 lambs also olos. That's 7, 8, 9, and there's also a so'er, a he-goat, which is also brought as a chatos. That means there are 10 animals to be brought, but 24 mishmaros. Therefore the Mishnah says, Chozru lefais kivir golim, it goes back to utilizing a lottery to decide lots, to decide which mishmar would bring the korbanos on Shmini Atzeres. The Mishnah concludes, obviously the porim, the bullocks, the largest of the animals, every mishmar would have wanted to have a par to bring rather than the smaller animal, the keves, the lamb, or the other animals. So what they did is the following. Omru, the Rabbonim said, Mi shehikriv porim hayom, whoever brought porim on one day, lo yakriv l'macha, wouldn't necessarily bring on the next day. But elochizrim cholila, it went round in a circle. What does that mean? Imagine there are the 14 plus the extra 2, there are 14 plus 10, 24 mishmaros in total. I'll just repeat that again. Okay, I'll just go over that. Imagine there are 24 mishmaros. Going back to the first day of Sukkot. 1 to 24. There are 13 porim to bring, which meant on the first day, mishmar number 1 up to mishmar number 13 would bring porim, a par each. On the second day, there are 12 porim to bring. But you would start with mishmar number 14 to bring all the porim, which means you will go from 14 up to 24, which is 11, inclusive, 14 to 24, 11 mishmaros, plus again, start with mishmar number 1, would also bring a par on the second day. That's because there were 12 porim to bring on the second day. On the third day, there were 11 porim to bring. You would start then from mishmar number 2 to complete all those Purim that would be brought, in other words, the 11 Purim would start from number 2 and go onwards. And wherever you would stop bringing the Purim on one day, it would be the next Mishmar where you would start counting your Mishmaros to bring the Purim. And that way it was most fair to enable everybody to have an opportunity as much as possible to keep bringing the Purim. That concludes.